I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. The Democrats have had a week or so to digest last Tuesday's electoral drubbing. It doesn't look any better in the rearview mirror. You probably know the major headlines. Trump-supported Republican Glenn Youngkin defeated Terry McAuliffe to become governor of Virginia, a state Joe Biden won by 10 points. Democrat Phil Murphy squeaked by for re-election as governor of New Jersey, a state Biden won by 16 points. And to add insult to injury, a Republican truck driver defeated the Democratic president of New Jersey's state Senate. In an editorial headlined, "Democrats Deny Political Reality at Their Own Peril," the Times wrote, quote, "Tuesday's election result trend lines were a political nightmare for the Democratic Party, and no Democrat who cares about winning elections in 2022 and the presidential race in 2024 should see them as anything less." Meanwhile, Joe Biden's polls continue to tank. Economist YouGov has him with a 44% job approval rating, with 51% disapprove. A USA Today poll was even worse, with a 38% approval. That same Economist YouGov poll asked about the direction of the country. A dismal 30% said right direction, 59% wrong track. On the bright side, the polls were taken before last week's good news for Biden and the Democrats. The House finally passed the trillion-dollar public works bill, and there was a solid jobs report pointing to a growing economy. But still, did the Democrats completely misread voters' concerns about inflation and schools? And are they ready for a significant course correction? We're joined by Peter Baker, the Times' chief White House correspondent, Mark Leibovich, the chief national correspondent for the New York Times Magazine. Peter, what was the problem with the Democrats in this cycle? Was it culture wars over mandates, critical race theory? Was it pandemic malaise? Was it all of the above? And what, if anything, could the Democrats do about it as they're heading into the midterms next year?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of those factors obviously at play. History is at play too. The party that owns the White House traditionally does not do well in the first off-year election that comes a year later. Virginia, for instance, has not, since 1977, has only elected a governor of the same party as the president one time. So in other words, it's a contrarian election where voters have their first chance to register their disapproval with how the incumbent administration is doing in Washington. This year, probably more than most, it did seem like a reflection of concern about the national state of affairs. Biden had promised to be an effective president. That was part of his selling approach to getting rid of Trump. But after a year in office or 10 months in office, he seemed to be still struggling to get through parts of his program, the biggest parts of his program. So I think that there was that soured things. Clearly, individual candidates made mistakes. Terry McAuliffe had a bad line about how parents shouldn't be in charge of their kids' schools. But the trend lines were across the board. So you can't just say it was one race or one candidate. I mean, in New Jersey, Phil Murphy nearly lost, even though Biden won there last year by 16 points. That's a wake-up call to the Democrats, and something I think that has them very concerned about next year's midterm elections, where they can't afford to lose a single seat in the Senate and only three, four seats in the House before they lose their majorities.
Mark, how much of this is a revival of the culture wars in a sense? Bret Stephens had a column in the Times the other day about wokeness. He said it connotes a lot more now than an effort to reform the police or denounce racial injustice. It strikes all sorts of issues about race, about justice, about whether America is working or not. It sort of fans the flame of every sort of aspect of American life. It goes to whether people are satisfied with schools, whether people are satisfied with homeschooling during the pandemic. What is going to the heart of this malaise, of this dissatisfaction?
Well, I think the conversation around quote unquote wokeness was very much played out around schools and education in Virginia. I mean, that was a real seminal issue. And I think, look, I think the Republican Party, in their efforts to sort of nationalize the kind of post or quasi post Trump message they have, is very much around culture. It's very much around Democrats being out of touch, whether around schools, whether around cancel culture and what have you. But I think this is going to be a theme that we're going to be hearing a great deal of in the coming years. And obviously, culture is something that Trump very much ran on. I think they're trying to refine this a little bit now to maybe take Trump personally out of it a little bit, at least in more swing blue states like Virginia. But I also think that this is really a ground that Republicans want to continue to hone, and I think we're going to be hearing more and more about it.
Jeremy Peters in the Times the other day was quoting Maya Wiley, who ran for mayor of New York earlier this year. She was writing in The Nation, or the New Republic rather, talking about the fact that Democrats seem to get the notion that they needed to be empathetic. We've heard this cry before, but why aren't they addressing issues like teaching about race, about border crossings, about border crossings now being a half-century high, about crime, about people rejecting the notion of defunding the police, about understanding the pain of people in America who are experiencing all sorts of pain? Why doesn't that resonate with the Democratic Party as much as it should?
Well, I mean, the Democrats didn't want to fight on what they perceived to be Republican territory. In other words, that the Republicans were setting the agenda, and that put the Democrats on defensive. If they talk about defunding the police, they are walking into a minefield. On the one hand, most Democrats who are running for office don't want to defund the police. And they see that as a political, danger zone in terms of the election. Certainly, even in Minneapolis, they rejected a ballot measure up there to recast the police department as a public safety department. On the other hand, they know that their base, a lot of people in their base feel very strongly about defunding the police, or at least some version of a radical reform of the police department. And they have to be careful about offending the people inside their own party who are very upset at these, the killings of Black Americans at the hands of police officers, like the George Floyd case. So it's a real minefield for them. They'd rather talk about anything other than that. On the education front, I think that they got, they kind of got ambushed in a way they didn't really expect. They didn't see the power of that issue. They didn't understand what Glenn Youngkin was doing in Virginia with it and how it resonated with many parents. And they didn't respond to it very effectively. They're going to have to figure out how to do that. Mark is absolutely right. Culture war is the battleground on which a lot of things are being fought right now, because America isn't really about isn't having a policy debate. It's having a tribal debate, right? People are voting for people not so much necessarily because they support this healthcare policy or that tax policy, but because they perceive that candidate to be somebody on their side who's fighting against the others, whoever the others are, whether they be liberals or conservatives or what have you. Trump encouraged that. That's how Trump profited for so many years, was encouraging these sort of tribal divisions in the culture. And that's become sort of the dominant feature of American elections right now.
So, Mark, how did the Democrats deal with this? Sean Patrick Maloney quoted in the Times the other day, he's the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee chairman, saying the Democrats have to, as usual, do a better job of getting the message across. So how do they take an issue like the police and say, we don't want to defund them, we want to give them more money so they can get better training? How do they deal with an issue like schooling, saying, we want to teach all sorts of theories in the school, not everyone wants racial justice. We don't want to apportion blame. We want to deal with the fundamental issue. How do they get a message across that becomes more encompassing, more embracing?
Well, the first thing they have to do is fashion one, frankly. And I think last week, what we saw in Virginia is, Terry McAuliffe was very one note. And he actually was trying to make this a culture race too. And the culture was Trump. He kept mentioning Trump at every turn. Glenn Youngkin seemed to be ignoring Trump as hard as he possibly could. And it was a winning formula for him. Now, in fairness, the purview that you talked about at the top of this has changed a little bit, because in the interim period between Virginia and when we're talking now, the infrastructure bill did pass. The Democrats do have something to run on. There is more message to sort of fashion something out of. Plus, the job numbers were very strong last week. So, I mean, there could be some kind of recovery narrative the Democrats could very much sort of latch onto that might save them from sort of having to be defensive about schools, about, you know, sort of the lingering pandemic, around inflation, things like that. But I also think that, look, I mean, they didn't even try to talk about this in Virginia, and I think they're very much at square one. And again, maybe the success they had recently on Capitol Hill can give them something to at least start out with.
Peter, how much is Biden responsible for this? Did he do enough? Obviously, he tried, and unfortunately for him, the public works bill, as Mark said, came after the election. Is the president at all responsible for the election defeats on early November?
Well, he's going to be held responsible whether he is or not, and that's the lot of being the incumbent president. Whether, no matter what you might want, that's what happens. You're responsible for any kind of election defeat that comes during your term, at least, especially in a race where you did play a role. You know, Terry McAuliffe didn't shy away from having Biden come in to campaign with him, whereas Glenn Youngkin didn't have Trump come in. Trump did a tele-rally at one point, but basically Youngkin tried to keep him out and try to not make him the issue. So Biden does own that. And the exit polls in Virginia showed that more Virginians disapproved of Biden than approved of him. And this is a state where he won by 10 points last year. That is again, a big red flag for Democrats. Now, the optimistic case for Democrats is to pull off of what Mark was just saying, is the infrastructure bill gives them something to talk about. It begins to erase at least a little bit of the notion that they can't get anything done. The economy does look like that there are some real promising signs. The job numbers were good. People's bank accounts are higher than they were. Wages are coming up. And this COVID developments of the last week are also promising. One is that they're starting vaccines now for children. That may help, isolate the virus and begin to diminish it. And secondly, there is now the promise of a new antiviral medicine that will be used after you get COVID to keep you from going to the hospital or dying. If those things prove to be as promising as they seem to be, that could end up making COVID in the next few months a much more manageable situation rather than the pandemic that it's been. All these things are things that could happen next few months and change the direction. The pessimistic note for Biden and the Democrats is that once an impression sets in, it's awfully hard to change it. And the impression that Biden is given right now is that he's not being a very effective president. Things like inflation, things like the Afghanistan pullout, all get, the gas prices going up, all give the impression of a president who's not on top of things.
It's a long time between now and a year from now in the midterms, but are the Republicans likely to embrace Trump or keep their distance from Trump between now and then?
I mean, that kind of is a $64,000 question in the Republican Party. I think it does vary from state to state, district to district to some degree. But I mean, Glenn Youngkin seemed to do it masterfully. I mean, he was not inflammatory at all towards Trump. He didn't poke the bear, but he also didn't alienate a lot of suburban voters in Virginia who seemed very ready to be alienated by anything he said that was overly supportive or overly Trumpy. So I don't think this is a comfortable position for many Republicans to be in, beginning with Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell. I don't think they know how to do it. And I think that there's already some signs of some early frictions between Trumpier Senate candidates like Eric Greitens in Missouri, who could be problematic, Herschel Walker in Georgia, and what a more sort of traditional, winning candidate for the Republicans might look like. So I think that's going to play out. I don't think they have an answer to that. And I think Trump, has been sort of their wild card, for better or worse, for 6 years now. And I don't think they're any closer to knowing, how that's going to sort of turn up in the next few months.
Peter, how much of this, as you said, do you think is the result of pandemic malaise, of parents having to deal with their kids home from school for a year and a half, even with the hope of the vaccine, having to deal with remote schooling and its implications and fears of how they're being taught about race, the frustration about the vaccine mandates, and how much of that is likely to go away in the next year, of course, depending on whether there's a cold weather surge and all those other variables. And then, of course, with the economy, what the implications are for increases in inflation and other variables that we still don't know about.
Yeah, there's no question there's a fatigue factor. You know, the number to look at is the one you cited early on, which is the right track, wrong track number. That's a long time barometer of the health of a political incumbent party. There's not a faith right now that things are going on the right track. Biden is not convinced the public that things are good. You know, our friend and colleague Neil Irwin wrote on the front page of the Times the other day that the economy actually, by a number of measures, is really pretty decent, you know, pretty good. Right now, unemployment is pretty low. If you want a job, you almost certainly can get one. People are feeling confident enough to quit jobs to go look for other ones. You have more money in your bank account on average, according to the statistics. But the inflation thing is giving the impression the economy is bad, and that most people, or a lot of people in polls, are saying that the economy is not working for them, even though the numbers look good. And if you can't convince the public that they like the economy, then you're going to have a hard time keeping them by your side when the next election comes around. So the challenge for Biden in the next few months, and it will set in early in 2022, is to convince the public that things are better than they think they are. And to show that he can get things done, and that, you know, that as you say, COVID will begin to recede, and the economy will feel more stable and reliable again. It's a big if, because in fact, again, you know, people's perceptions aren't necessarily tied to specific, you know, factual developments. Once they're set in, it's hard to change. But you know, there are glimmers, I think, of hope for Biden if he can prove to take advantage of them.
Mark, a quick, almost yes, no answer. Given the vote on the public works bill, does that bode well for getting more done in the next couple of months in Congress?
Maybe. It might. I think there are two ways of looking at it. This is not yes, no, but there are two ways of looking at it. One is that, okay, maybe the economy is turning around. There could be some less urgency to actually do something. Or on the other hand, you know, maybe there is some momentum that these actually look like they could be popular and they could be a reconciliation bill in the next few months.
Almost yes, no. Mark Leibovich, Peter Baker of the New York Times, thank you for joining us. And coming up next, the state of New York City's economy. We're just 2 weeks away from Thanksgiving, the official kickoff of the holiday season. That would normally mean shoppers hitting the stores in a frenzy and international tourists flooding New York and spending plenty of money on hotels, restaurants, Broadway shows, and shopping. But these are not normal times. The pandemic hit the city's economy hard, and maybe the biggest hit was to the vital tourism industry. The Times writes, quote, before the pandemic, tourists spent $47 billion annually and supported more than 280,000 jobs, according to official estimates. About half of that came from international visitors, though they accounted for just 20% of all visitors. This year, the city's tourism agency forecast visitor spending of about $24 billion, half of the 2019 total. Now that the feds are allowing vaccinated international travelers into the country, the city is ready to spend millions to lure tourists back to help jumpstart the economy. But will those tourists come? And will office workers return to their offices, which is critical for the survival of businesses like restaurants, retailers that depend on them to spend money? Let's talk about the state of the city's economy with Matthew Haag, a Metro reporter for the Times. Matt, Governor Hochul says she's going to invest hundreds of millions of dollars to help the tourist industry in New York. How much help is that actually going to help?
Hi, Sam. Thank you for having me on. Yes, Governor Hochul has announced millions of dollars to assist the tourism industry, especially those who have been out of work. And you look at the job numbers, the tourist industry, those who worked in hospitality, hotels, restaurants, museums, it's just down dramatically since before the pandemic. That's going to be a boost to those kind of people. But the big question is, when will the tourists come back, and how many will come back? I walked Fifth Avenue recently on a weekday, and it felt like a pre-pandemic Saturday or Sunday. There were more people out. People were shopping. There were lines outside a Nike store and the Apple store. but it wasn't like the pre-pandemic Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, where it's just swarms of people. Now, the international tourists came back recently this week, and as you said, they accounted for 50% of the spending of tourism, but it's not at the same level that it was, because British Airways said they're going to have maybe 6 flights a day. That's about half as many as they used to have, but they spend so much, and so it's important to at least get that going and to see where that will take us before Black Friday and the Thanksgiving week, and then Christmas just 6 weeks away.
Matt, is there any difference in where the tourists are coming and how they will spend money on that basis?
Well, so I think it's too early to know. And we know thousands of people have already come, but it's too early to know where they are staying, whether they're staying over in New York or connecting elsewhere, where they're spending money. But we know that the hospitality industry is ready for this. The hotel rates have been low for a long time. They're eager to fill up their rooms and get people going. And there's a lot of optimism, but I think it's truly to know where they're going to spend their money and how robust it's going to be, and whether it will be on target. I mean, we are down to just a few million international tourists this year, which is just a fraction of what it used to be. And they say it won't be till 2024 until we get back to the pre-pandemic levels. But that projection was made a year ago. So where does that stand now? There's a lot of questions to be answered.
And where are all these workers? So what are they doing? The people who've been out of work, the people who've been laid off in the hotels, the restaurants, Broadway, and all those other industries that have been so hard hit by this?
Well, that's the big thing behind the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate was about 11, 12, 10% for many months. It just fell below 10%. But if you dig into those numbers, it's not because people were going back in robust numbers. It's because people are leaving the labor force. And that's the untold stories, that people are retiring, people are holding out for better jobs, perhaps reluctant to work in the service industry on the front lines because of concerns over COVID. So people need to get back to work. People are, after 18 months, it's just a different ballgame than other recessions. And people are eager to see what it will take to get people to be comfortable, and whether people will be comfortable going back into the office, for instance, more than a couple of days a week.
Well, let's talk about that in a minute. You've written about the fact that co-working seems to be expanding in the suburbs. It's going to be difficult to get people, or at least lots of people, back into offices. Many people don't have to go back. So what's going to happen with all that space, particularly in Manhattan?
Well, there was a sobering survey that was released recently of large businesses in New York City that said that just 8% of their employees are going back to work every single day of the week. Just 8%. 28% are going back at least one day a week. And they say that in the future, a third of those big businesses will cut their space in the office because they don't need it. People will be working hybrid, perhaps co-working in the suburbs. So there's a lot of questions about if they give up that space, what people over for conference rooms, for instance, which is what the real estate industry hopes happens. But the reality is, there are a lot of things that we can't predict about whether it'll be converted to residential, which has been one suggestion. We don't know what's going to happen, but that is one of the big questions that's hanging over the city for perhaps years to come.
And why are companies like Google at the same time taking office space?
Well, they're taking office space, but it's really space that they announced many years ago that they were already planning to do. And they are behind the scenes making plans for reconfiguring those spaces for employees who come in a couple of days a week. As I said, conference rooms, for instance, getting people together in big groups that share ideas and collaborate. But they're not really preparing for people to come back 5 days a week. So that's sort of, when you dig behind the numbers, yes, companies may be leasing space, but it's not like they're leasing it for the same purpose as they used to.
And as we pointed out, we're coming up on Thanksgiving, which is unofficially the beginning of the holiday shopping season. What about retail, stores in particular? How are they going to compete with online shopping? Things going to be any better this year than before?
Well, that's why the pandemic was so devastating for retail, because they were competing with online before this even happened. And this just accelerated our buying habits to online because of the convenience and safety of doing that. You know, you walk through Soho or Fifth Avenue, Madison Avenue, the stores are there. There are lots of empty ones, but the stores are there and they're eager to get customers in. I saw them putting up the Christmas decorations on Fifth Avenue at Bergdorf and Saks. So they're preparing like it's going to be any other shopping season. We know it's not going to be. I wouldn't say it's make or break, but they need this to be much more stronger than it was last year, which by all means it probably will be. But how far away from pre-pandemic, it'll probably be pretty far.
Is there anything being done, particularly with smaller stores, retail outlets, like commercial rent control or any other things institutionally that might make it easier for smaller retailers?
There's nothing really afoot on a large scale for that. There are some small businesses that are saying that their brokers are coming to them with creative lease proposals saying, you can share a percentage of your profits or revenues toward the lease versus a set amount. So there's some creativity on the margins, but there's nothing wholesale to help small businesses to pay what is often tens of thousands of dollars a month in rent when you just don't know whether you're going to make more than a few sales a day.
And tell me about jobless benefits. Have they all run out in the federal program, or are people who were unemployed as a result of the pandemic still eligible to receive any?
They've largely run out. There's still the state unemployment benefits, which are just a fraction of what the supplement that the federal government provided. So it's just a small fraction, a couple $100 a week, really not a lot to help people. And so it's out. It's run its course a couple months ago, but yet the unemployment rate didn't, dive down. People didn't rush back to work. And that's what we've seen in other states. And that's what's playing out here. It's just this pandemic and the recession abroad is proving to be different from past economic downturns.
Very quick question. Are we going to continue with outdoor dining?
I think so. That has been a bright spot, and it's pretty fun to see what kind of creative things people can do. And I think people love it. Businesses love it. Diners love it. I think that's here to stay.
Thanks to Matthew Haag of the New York Times. And for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I am Sam Roberts.